but you can definitely see a different finish using the enchanted blue as a base layer. Hello and welcome to part 7 of painting Shadows in the North, Kings of War 2-player starter set by Mantic Games. In this episode, we'll paint the horror. So I started painting this model in much the same way as I did with the Butchers, which is using contrast paints and heavy ink glazes over a zenithal undercoat. This model is quite small and quite intricate, and it's also made out of their annoying rustic stuff, which is quite hard to clean up, but I did as best I could. You'll still see a few mould lines on it. Now, it's been a while since I painted the Butchers, and I forgot to add in some black Templar to this mix, so it's a lot brighter. Adding in some red ink here, just to make the plummy colour for the tendrils, because the blue and the plum is a colour combination that I used on a lot of the other Nightstalkers. You can see that this approach using contrast paints and sort of heavy ink glazes is really quite hard to apply over a model with a lot of intricate details, just partly because of the way the paint needs to flow off the brush. But I go ahead and start painting the model like this anyway, and I get to a point where I decide I want to paint it in a more traditional manner. So I've got an old tub of Citadel enchanted blue here. You can see that the lid was a bit cracked, so I'm going to replace that. I love sort of getting out the old paints. It's really a real bit of nostalgia for me. So we're going to move over to a more traditional painting method now, and you do layering and some normal glazing. So you can see straight away there's a lot more coverage in this sort of like more traditional paint, although it is, as far as blues go, it's reasonably desaturated. That's why I've added a little bit of blue ink just to strengthen it up. Totally different painting style here, so being quite careful where we're applying it rather than slapping it all on like we would with the contrast paints. So there you go, you can see a much more even coverage. So we're going to use some dark sea blue now, just to paint that sort of furry bit on him. By the time the model's finished, I'm really pleased with it overall, but I'd say that the fur is one part that doesn't quite come out as well as I'd hope it would, and let me know in the comments when we get to the end if you feel the same. I'm really just base coating all the fur areas. I say fur, again I don't know, same as some of the other Nightstalker models, I'm not really sure if it is meant to be fur or hair, but I decided to paint it different to the purple sort of magical tendril type things that are all over the model. Using quite a small brush here, I think it's a size 1. Completely different approach to the contrast paint where you can just use a bigger brush and let the paint flow right off the end of it. Much more controlled here. Going to use some Warlord purple mixed with a bit of blue ink. You can see that comes out way too blue, so I add in a bit more Warlord purple to the mix. Yeah, too much paint on the brush there, too thin, too much, so wipe a bit off. At this point of the process, I'm still trying to make use of the zenithal undercoat, but by the time I put a couple of layers on, I realise I'm just going to have to forget about that and paint it in like I said before, a much more traditional manner, just layers really. I'm basically trying to move towards a more magenta colour on these magical tendrils. The Warlord purple fits really nicely with paint that we're going to use shortly, which is magenta. You can see we're moving more towards that magenta sort of colour from what was a more plum colour in the sort of like first version of the painting that we started. We're basically going to completely overpaint all the contrast paint that we put on at the start. Yeah, this is definitely one of those paint jobs that kind of looks really rough and quite rubbish until fairly late on. Yeah, you can see I've got an annoying sort of cat hair stuck on the end of my brush there, hanging off, or you might see it. He'll probably make an appearance later in the video. When I first got this model out of the box, seeing what it was made out of and seeing how bad the mould lines were, I was quite annoyed with it, but I really enjoyed painting it. You can see my really old enchanted blue here has got a new lid, so I popped a new lid on there. Mixing in some electric blue to start the highlighting process on the skin. Just making a gradient there on my sort of DIY wet palette. You can see it's sort of somewhat thinned down, but not super thin, so just a layer, you know, a fairly thin layer. And just going around and painting the highlights on all the muscles, probably covering up about 50% of the base layer. Oh yeah, there we go, there he is. That's kind of why I got cat hairs everywhere. Yeah, like a completely different painting style and painting process to the rest of this set. But, you know, I really enjoyed sitting down and taking my time with this model. Just using a size 1 brush here. I wouldn't normally paint like that, sort of pushing the brush. It's partly because I'm painting it on camera, really. Basically, I tried holding the model in a different way so I could paint it, dragging the paint towards the part that I wanted highlighted, but my hand was just way too, you know, it was just covering up the camera, so it looked a bit weird there, but the end result was the same, which was to finish the paint stroke at the point where you want most of the paint coming off, i.e. the highlight area. This guy's got some super strong quads, and I really enjoy painting these bits as well, and I think they're probably, you know, if you're only going to watch like a little bit of this video to see what the results like using this paint combination to produce blue skin, just sort of like flick through and see how this this part of his leg looks, because, you know, I think it ends up looking pretty good. And you know, as we sort of speed up here and sort of go through painting other highlights on the model, what I end up doing is coming back and looking at that muscle group on the leg around that left knee and judging how much highlight I need to put on the rest of the model based on how that left leg is looking. It's kind of how I paint as well when we're doing a model with this kind of painting style where you go back and forward. You know, I'll highlight up the skin to a point that I'm sort of somewhat happy with, then I'll move in and start painting some other parts of the model, see how that looks in comparison to the level of highlights on the skin, and then maybe go back and put more highlights in potentially, and that is what we do with this model later on. So just waiting for parts to dry and then going in and working up the highlights a bit more with the same colour mix to start with. Obviously this guy's not a human, but he has got some weird extra muscles in certain places. But you know, I just painted what was on, you know, what was sculpted on. You know, even at this point, I'm kind of sort of, as I'm painting this, I'm pretty happy with how it's starting to look. You can see the backs of the legs there haven't had any highlights yet. So this is mainly the electric blue now, doing some smaller highlights. Just pulling the paint towards the part that I want most light. Using a wet brush here because I went a bit over the top. The paint was a little bit too thick, but you know, there was too much of that highlight colour. So I always have that sort of like thicker wet brush to hand, and you can wipe it off really easily if you're quick. Now you can also use that wet brush to sort of feather out the highlights sort of back towards the midtones or the base layer or whichever step you're at. You know, I know I was moaning about the state of this model in terms of the mould lines, but it's actually pretty intricate. You can see there are all the little knuckles on the feet, and they're quite, you know, if you got a reasonably steady hand and a good brush, they're quite a fun thing to paint. You get a good result from not too much work, as long as you're able to put the paint like right on those sort of knuckly bits. So I'm thinking that the hands and the knuckles are going to be a real focal point of the model, in addition to the face, because you've got sort of fairly sharp areas in the knuckles, and you've also got all that magical stuff sort of flowing out between his fingers. So I spend, you know, a bit more time making sure the knuckles and the hands look, you know, pretty good. So really just adding sort of more highlights where the skin would be more taut and the knuckles would be sharp. Still using that mix of enchanted blue and electric blue, using mainly electric blue as the highlights progress. So moving on to the face, we're really just going to highlight all the ridges, and I decided to just do the highlights how I think is going to look good, rather than maybe being like absolutely like perfectly spot on from a zenithal point of view. So on the face here, I'm going to highlight those sort of ridges on the top of his head towards the front of the face. And you can see like in the sculpt there's these little lines on this sort of like bit of skin where his mouth is sort of distended. So I'm going to highlight those as well to sort of make sure we make use of that texture. So Vallejo model Sky Blue, I put this on the palette, mix it in with a bit of the electric blue. I didn't shake the pot very well to start with, so just be wary of that. If you've got some of these, any paints really, but the Vallejo ones in particular, if they're sitting on the shelf for a while, even if you shake them a reasonable amount, you're mainly going to get just the medium coming out to start with. So, you know, a reasonably thin mix, not loads of water added, just, you know, the brush is just damp, the paint is, you know, reasonably thin, because there's quite a bit of medium in that first sort of squirt out that I put on the wet palette. Got that cat hair hanging off the front of the brush. And just using the lighter colour to add smaller and smaller areas of highlight over the areas that we've already done with the electric blue. Like I said, I'm just enjoying painting this model. It's, you know, quite therapeutic to just sit and paint one model to a bit of a higher standard, taking your time. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. So, like I said earlier, I'm going to sort of flip between the purples and the blues, and I want to start highlighting up the magical stuff. So, here we go. Classic Vallejo dropper bottle here. Oh, that's not coming out at all. Ah, there we go. Loads. That's my fault, really. I should have shook them up more and maybe cleared out the end a little bit. So just going to mix some gradients here between the Warlord Purple, the Magenta and the Squid Pink. You can see that's quite, quite thin, and I just wiped a fair amount of that off on a paper towel at the side of the desk there. Now this really starts bringing the magical elements of the model much more towards a brighter magenta. The Warlord Purple is a great base, but I want this guy to stand out, so we're going quite a bit brighter and towards the magenta. Leaving the recessed areas as they were, and I want the areas where the tendrils finish. So there's a few bits on the legs where they go into little spikes, and on the back, and then in particular between the fingers. They're the areas I want to be most highlighted, because I want them to contrast with the skin. at this point we're still really just sort of bringing the whole thing towards the magenta, but leaving the recesses as they were. So almost pure magenta now. You can see it's, you know, a little bit thin. It's not straight out the bottle. The wet brush has thinned it down a bit. The wet palettes thinned it down a little bit. And again, we're just pulling these highlights of these sort of magical tendril things much more towards the magenta now. Especially towards the edges here. Painting this horror and then the Packmaster, not the Packmaster, the Master Hunter, which will be the final painting video for this series. With the last couple of videos I've done without a really good monitor to view the focus of the camera that I'm using, so you know, the focus isn't brilliant on this video or the next one. I've tried to just use clips where the focus is a little bit better. And you know, it's not too bad, you can still see what I'm doing, but hopefully after these next couple of videos the focus will be a lot better. So bringing in a bit of that squid pink now, mix that into the previous mix, and we're using this to highlight the magenta areas. The squid pink's a bit more desaturated, so a bit later we'll go over with a glaze of magenta. On the tongue here I'm just sort of highlighting the areas which I think would catch the sun, so at the top of that bridge where the tongue's sort of quite close in the back of the mouth, and then also the tip of the tongue. So just using the squid pink now, we're going to highlight the ends of all these tendrils, and then we're going to have a look where we are in contrast to the highlights that we've put on the blue skin. I'm really liking it so far though. I feel like it's starting to look like it's some sort of like magical stuff that's flowing between the fingers and that he's sort of floating along on. Really focusing on the areas between the fingers. I think they're going to be a real focal point of this model. And weirdly, even more so than the face. You know, the face is fine, although it's a little bit, it's a weird one. I'm not sure what I think about the sculpt of the face. It's definitely, you know, quite unique with that massive mouth. But I like the idea of like focusing on the hands, because they're the thing that's doing something. It feels like that's where the magic's going to come from this model. Yeah, just taking my time going around putting those highlights on it. You know, all the bits that I want to stand out. It's really the ends of these sort of magical tendrils, and they're like on the bits where the tendrils kind of like kink around the body. I feel like, you know, those are the bits that would be kind of like, you know, pulsating with magic. I haven't done too much highlighting of the blue skin on the back of the legs. What we're going to do now is going to add I would use something like ice yellow, but I didn't have any, so I'm mixing a bit of white and light yellow from Vallejo Model Colour to make a light yellow, basically, then add that into the squid pink. I wanted to do that rather than just using white, because the squid pink is already, you know, quite a desaturated colour, and like I said earlier, I want this to sort of stand out quite a bit. So these are kind of like almost the final highlights. You can see I'm using this like, you know, pretty sparingly. I don't want the magical elements to start looking pink or even yellowy. I want them to be, you know, purple and magenta. This is just, you know, just highlighting the magenta. This is really just to give it that sort of like magical electrical kind of look. I want to just see where we are with the fur on the model. We're kind of highlighting everything else up, and that's been left with just the base colour. So using some dark Reaper, we're going to dry brush to start with over the fur. And to be honest, probably would have been better to have done this to start with, because I had to be more careful than normal not to get that sort of darker colour over the skin or the magical elements. But you know, it was all right, and there's quite a bit of texture in the fur on this model, so dry brushing actually works well. Now this was maybe a mistake. I wanted to tie in the skin colour, so I used the enchanted blue, and I think maybe the enchanted blue is a bit pastel-y. I think it you know, that does tie it into the model, but I'm just not sure how it ends up looking at the end. I'm not 100% sold on it basically. So I've done some dry brushing to just add the initial highlight, and now using a small brush, I'm going to layer on a bit of that same enchanted blue and dark Reaper mix, just to pick out some areas that we want to be a bit more highlighted. You know, the dry brushing is great as a starting point, but I can't go at this with the dry brush because I'm going to get it on other parts of the model. So I'm picking out the parts of the fur that are facing upwards, like I have done with all the muscles, and I'm going to pick out parts that are on like a horizontal plane across his butt area basically. So you'll see me indicate with the brush in a minute that horizontal plane that I'm talking about. There we go. So a bit in the same way that you might highlight hair. You don't really want to highlight down the whole of every strand. You want to pick a part where it would be natural for the light to highlight across the across the model, you know, across that hair. Added some sky blue into the previous mix, so you know, keeping consistent with the colours that I've used on the skin, just to add some further careful highlights to the fur. I felt that it wasn't bright enough in comparison to the skin, and I wanted the highlights to kind of tie in with the skin colours. So that's why we're using the same highlight colour, or the same paint, to produce a highlight colour. So really just painting this lighter mix in a smaller area over the previous highlights. I think overall it looks okay. There's just something about the fur. Maybe when we finish the model, maybe it just needed like an extra highlight or something. But again, you know, let me know what you think. That's where we are so far. You know, I think it's starting to look pretty good. Some German grey here, you know, reasonably thinned down. Just I find this paint quite thick as a starting point. So I decided I didn't want the claws and the teeth to be like your traditional bone kind of colour. I wanted them to be a bit darker than that. So we're going to base coat with German grey to darken the base layer up. I really like the German grey. It's a really interesting colour. Sometimes it feels like it's got a bit of blue in it when you look at it. Sometimes it actually feels like it's more slightly towards the brown. It's just an interesting colour. So just base coating all the teeth and claws. And really, really carefully, as careful as I can, just painting in the eye with this colour as well. Not the best angle on the camera there, but you can kind of see what I'm doing, being really careful. Getting a bit of the excess off there while leaving a reasonable amount in the brush so that it doesn't dry out while I'm holding my hands together to balance. I'm really clamping the palms of my hands together and just using the fingers to manoeuvre the brush as carefully as I can. So mixing a bit of red ink into the magenta. And that's just to strengthen up the magenta to make a thin sort of reddy magenta glaze, and I'm just going to put over all the like magical areas. I just wanted to make it a little bit redder, a little bit more back to the magenta after putting the highlights on. I found the squid pink did desaturate it quite a bit. This is really just a thin glaze, and I only did one glaze. I didn't want it to end up being red. I'm swapping back and forward here between the parts I'm painting, because as the model's progressing, I want all the areas to start being highlighted at a similar pace so I can really see what it looks like. Just mixed in some earth to the German grey to sort of highlight the teeth. So I'm using the dark sea blue that we used on the fur, mixing in some Incubi Darkness from Games Workshop to produce a glaze to darken up some of the shadow areas on the muscles. I really wanted this project to sort of like all tie in together. That's why I'm using, you know, the same sort of shadow and highlight colours across different parts of the model. So this is really quite thin, and just doing a careful glaze underneath all the big muscles, just working my way around. Particularly on the face there, trying to add some more contrast around that sort of like that skin area, you know, the cheeks, you know, add some more darkness under the cheeks. Provide some more contrast on the fingers there underneath the knuckles. Same around the muscles on the chest and the abs around the knee. It's really just a case of adding in some shadows to increase the contrast, and I'll also use this colour to go and just carefully line the areas between the muscle and between the muscles and the magical magenta areas. I feel like this is a good way of producing additional contrast without going much further with the highlights. So same thing here, using that same mix, very thin, just producing some additional contrast on the face. Just additional shade really. Moving the brush and leaving the paint in the areas that you want to be darker, in the same way that you'd move the brush and leave the highlights in the areas that you wanted to be lighter. I probably went round and did maybe 3 or 4 glazes because I wanted the shadows to be quite dark, because as I showed you at the start, we kind of lost some of that zenithal look because the zenithal prime that I did from the top, the white, was pretty heavy. And the rest of this army, if you've watched some of the other videos, you'll know that using the zenithal undercoat, they were very dark underneath. So I wanted this guy to, you know, I wanted him to stand out, but I also wanted him to fit the general theme of the army, which was, you know, quite dark from underneath. That's why I'm spending a bit of extra time going around and putting in quite a few layers of this this shade colour, using it just to add some separation to that muscle on the quad there. You can see that I ended up dragging the brush over the highlight a little bit, so just really quickly wipe that off with my finger. Using a small brush here, I think this is a size 0. Just using the Vallejo model colour Earth to start highlighting the teeth. It might have been interesting to paint these teeth almost like horns, where you sort of like almost like do an inverse highlight and have them lighter towards the gums, but I don't know, it just didn't seem to quite fit with this guy. You could see me there when I was painting those nails. There just wasn't quite enough paint on the brush, and by the time I sort of got the paint on the brush, made a point and then moved it over to the toes, it had dried to the point where there wasn't much coming out. So just pick up a bit more paint, just enough really that you can do the job so it doesn't flow off the end. Adding some Game Air khaki into the mix now to further highlight the teeth and the claws. I wasn't really going for like a rotten teeth look, more just I wanted them to just be darker, you know, darker than like, you know, normal human teeth. It's actually quite, like I said before, it's quite a nice sculpt. There's a lot of detail in the feet and the claws. You know, if you've got the time and the will to, you know, sit and highlight these areas, they end up looking pretty good just because of how detailed they are. So I'm adding some Ushabti bone into the mix there. You can see, you know, pretty, you know, reasonably thin, but not super thin. So you can see it's not super thin, but enough that it'll just paint off the brush nicely without being really thick, and just highlighting almost the tips now. Okay, so now most parts of the model have had some highlights. I can get a feel for how it's looking, and I want to deepen the shadow areas a little bit more on the skin. So we're going back to that dark sea blue and incubi darkness glaze, just to, like I said, add some more shadow in, and in particular around the areas where the magical elements meet the skin, just to provide some separation. As I'm painting around the back of the legs here, I start to feel that they're not highlighted enough in comparison to the front of the model, especially like on those calves on the back of his legs. They are pointing upwards quite a lot, so we will go in and add some more highlights there. Yeah, you can see I'm indicating that I quite like how the front of the legs are looking, but the back of the legs here, they would definitely catch the light a bit more, so sort of highlighting the calves and the ankles, the heels a bit more, because they are pointing almost directly up towards where the light source would be coming from. So same process, just carefully moving the paint towards the areas that we want to be lighter. And it's not straight out of the bottle, but it's not thinned down loads. There's the bristles of the brush are wet, the wet palette keeps it a little bit wet, and then depending on how it's feeling, I might add a tiny little bit of water, but not much. So really like a thin layer. And while the paint's on my brush, I go around and sort of emphasize the highlights a little bit on some of the other muscles. Yeah, those legs are starting to match the highlights on the back. It's starting to feel a lot more sort of natural in inverted commas. So getting a bit of that sky blue now, and pushing the highlights a bit more on some of the areas that would catch the light more. So like the sinews and the knuckles, the sort of sharper areas of the model. And some of these other muscles that just look visually appealing if you highlight them a little bit further. So you can see I'm really only adding a very small area of highlight to these muscles now. Areas like that little bit there that I just painted, that sort of bit of sinew between the chest muscle and the shoulder. They're quite thin areas, so they would, they should catch the light a little bit more. They're sharper, basically. By this point, I'm really enjoying painting the model. I feel like it's coming together. It's looking a lot better, and I'm just enjoying pushing the highlights on the different colours. When it comes to keeping some motivation to keep a project going, I think being able to do this sort of character model was quite refreshing in comparison to the big units that I'd already painted. Having said that, I did have quite a break between painting those and painting this one, so maybe I wasn't, quite as super motivated as I was making out there. I said at the start it was a project that would get done, and it is getting done, just maybe taking longer than I'd hoped. I really like the Vallejo model colour Sky Blue as a highlight colour for blue, so you know, if you're looking at some of the paints I'm using and you haven't got them, and you may be thinking of picking some up, then the dark sea blue to be a shade colour for blues or greens is brilliant. And then I like this sky blue as being, you know, a great colour for highlighting blue, as long as you're wanting to highlight quite high. So you can see the face isn't highlighted up as much as other areas of the skin, so we're going to focus on the face now. So we're using that sky blue to push the highlights on those sort of bony ridges on the face there, and then across that horizontal bit that sits in front of the teeth. We'll highlight that again shortly. When I say cheekbones, it's not really cheekbones, but the bits underneath the eyes, they would definitely catch the light. That's why they're being highlighted a bit more. And we're going to use the highlights to emphasize that texture on the side of the cheeks as well. It's convenient to hold the model in a way where I can use the side of the brush on those protruding areas down the cheeks. That's a real nice way of doing those kind of like almost like edge highlights. It's a lot easier than using the point of the brush. So we are still using the sky blue here, but because we're going over areas that we've already painted with sky blue, these smaller areas that we're now painting are appearing lighter and lighter, and they are, you know, pretty small areas, to the point where on the toes and the knuckles, I'm almost just dotting them. A lot of the rest of this video is going to be just pushing the final highlights, but I think it is worth watching. Well, I think it's worth watching, you'll make the decision on that. What I mean is I enjoy painting it, so I'm quite happy as I'm sat here doing the voiceover rewatching this, because I enjoy painting the model. It's really just a case now of going around and picking out the areas that I think are going to make the model more visually appealing to be highlighted further. Whether it would be environmentally correct for them to be highlighted in this way, I'm not entirely sure. I think overall the model looks like it's highlighted from above, which is what I was going for, but really these sort of extra highlights at the end are just to make the model more visually appealing, so kind of like more artistic license, I guess, rather than maybe being, you know, perfectly environmentally correct. One thing, for example, is to be visually appealing, in my opinion, you want the face, which is a focal point in addition to those knuckles, to be at least as well highlighted as, say, some of the more, you know, more boring muscle areas. So some of the areas on the back where the muscles are highlighted, you know, I don't want those to be more highlighted than the face, for example. It'll look a bit weird, in my opinion. You know, as we're making these highlights and I'm sort of rewatching the painting process, I'm conscious that I mentioned earlier about the fur being an area that I wasn't sort of like overly pleased with. I'm not really sure what I would do differently. I don't want it to stand out different from the blue of the skin. I want it to be a kind of like a more maybe greeny or a grey colour to the skin. So yeah, if you've got ideas on that, you know, what you do differently, let me know. What you saw me doing then was just using a little bit of the enchanted blue, the kind of like mid-layer, base layer. I glazed it over that thigh muscle because I'd highlighted it up a little bit too much, I felt. What I mean is that I'd highlighted a too large area, so I just sort of used the enchanted blue to make the middle of the muscle more of a mid-tone. Yeah, just working back in some of the shadows now. We've worked up the highlights and we've glazed back in some shadows, including that sort of muscle separation there on the quad again. What I wanted to do here was go back in with a squid pink and use that over larger areas. I know I'd already gone back and glazed some of the magenta earlier, back over some of the squid pink areas, but as the model's progressing, I wanted a slightly larger highlight. So this is just a case of how I do models like this. I go back and forward, and maybe I want the highlights to cover a larger area on a certain part of the model because I've highlighted a different part to a higher level. I don't know if that makes sense, but basically, as the skin was being highlighted, I felt like the electrical areas needed a bit more work, basically. Using exactly the same colours as I used earlier, the squid pink, and then this mix where we add a little bit of yellow and a little bit of white into the very sort of final highlights. I hope that kind of made sense what I'm talking about, sort of going back and forward with the magentas and the blues. It's just one of those things that I like to do as the model progresses. When you watch some like really skilled painters, I'm always amazed at how they can paint a section of the model in one go. So for example, they might just paint all the skin on this guy, and they will intrinsically know exactly how far to push the highlights, and then they'll move on to the electrical, then they'll move on to these magical elements, and they'll paint those in one go, and the highlights will just come together perfectly. You know, I'm just not good enough for that, so I go back and forward until I feel like the whole model looks right, you know, to my eyes. The Game Air White is quite thin, so we can use it out of the bottle to just carefully paint the eyes here. The German Grey darkened up that whole sort of eye socket. Now I'm using the, I decided I want the eyes to be white, so I'm just going straight in with the Game Air White. You're going to need a couple of coats if you want it to be like a dead white, which is what I wanted with this guy. I just wanted the eyeballs to be just dead white. Using some Vallejo model colour ivory to add a final highlight onto the teeth. It's really just the tips of the teeth that we're painting here. Same thing on the toenails here. Claws, you know what I mean. While it's on the brush, I'm also using it as a very final highlight to just dot the highlight areas on the magical elements that we've already highlighted a little bit towards the yellow earlier with the mix of squid pink, light yellow and white. The ivory just puts a final point on these. And you can see I really am just going around and just dotting them. Yeah, just putting some dots all over the final highlight areas. I think it really sort of adds a nice final touch. Same on the tongue here, just sort of final little highlight there on that bridge. And then towards the tip there. Corn red and Lamia medium, just to very quickly paint the inside of the mouth. I don't want to Don't want to do too much with the inside of the mouth here. I just want it to look a bit red, a bit more red. I noticed now I'm watching the video and after taking some photos that he's even got like a little thingy that hangs down the back of your throat there. So, you know, quite detailed sculpt. Adding just a little bit of that corn red into the shadows of the magical elements. Not much. It's quite thin, so it really is just a glaze. And here's a comparison with one of the butchers that we painted earlier. So, you know, there's a theme. They've got similar colours, and you know, I think they'll look fine on tabletop when based similarly. But you can definitely see a you know, different finish using the enchanted blue as a base layer. Now I'm pretty pleased with that. So, you know, let me know what you think. Let me know what you do differently. You know, give us a like and leave us a comment if you've got anything in particular you want to mention. Got one more model to paint, and then we'll be moving on to the multi-basing for the Nightstalkers and the Northern Alliance. You can see when we move the model up and down there that it is still a lot darker underneath, so we still got that kind of like overall zenithal look.